those of you who aren't snow bunnies and haven't escaped to the warm weather, I hope we'll keep it interesting enough for you. As you know, I've been trying to paint a picture of this country as I knew it during my formative years, 1936 to 1945, because they were, in a larger sense, formative years for this country as well. Our first three sessions dealt primarily with a peacetime America. In our last session, I turned 11, it was Pearl Harbor. War broke out. My childhood abruptly ended. Today, June 1944, I'm 14. D-Day happens. And my maternal grandparents, my grandfather particularly, couldn't write English very well. He left the bulk of his literary skills behind in a place called Belarus in 1904 at the outbreak of the Russo-Japanese War, which we talked about last session. He bribed the border guards to get out to avoid being recalled back into an army to fight for a czar that he hated and who hated him. This deficiency with letters, however, did not prevent him from earning a fine living, starting a business in 1904, salvaging used barrels from the downtown of Cleveland along the Cuyahoga River, where a lot of the industrial giants were. He would take those barrels, take them to his barrel yard and recooper them and resell them as used barrels. Now, doing that, and from these humble beginnings and calloused hands and arduous labor, often from dawn, often long into the night, and from taking in boarders, which people did in those days, he and my grandmother were able to put my mother through school of education. More precisely for this talk, her two brothers, my uncles, through medical school. They were all part of the great American dream. The sanctity of this great nation of ours was not something they had to be taught. It was ingrained in them as they and refugees like them built this country, a country that had offered them sanctuary, a sanctuary when it was desperately needed. So my mother's brother did not need a civics lesson to inspire him. Shortly after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, which we discussed last session, on that historical day of infamy, despite the fact that he just become the father of an infant daughter, Jennifer, he volunteered for one of the most dangerous medical mission teams ever assembled by the United States military. Became a frontline surgeon, and an airborne one at that. Now, during my growing up years, my grandparents and my parents lived in the same house. So I spent a great deal of my childhood with my maternal grandparents. Since I could write with ease and they couldn't, I became their professional scrivener at 5 cents a letter. You see, in those days, I was a young entrepreneur, even then. During the war, I wrote their letters to their son, the frontline surgeon, on V-mail. It was, some of you may remember it, it was that very thin paper you wrote on, could easily be opened by the Army and censored. And I read his letters back to them. It was an avocation that was to bring me face to face with unparalleled trauma, particularly so during the long days and nights, the period June 1944 to June 1945. But it also led me to an astounding revelation 65 years later, to an ineffable happening behind the beaches of Normandy, behind the beaches which we'll discuss today. Human capacities are often stretched beyond their limits in time of war, particularly in the front lines of battle. Most of those who experience the intensity and the horror of frontline combat are reluctant to talk about it. Very few who survive with their humanity intact survive those kinds of ordeals are remembered. Sadly, their acts often disappear into the ether. They are reluctant to talk about it. What follows is a story of such acts and their intriguing aftermath. The Cotentin juts out into the English Channel like a thumb. Peninsula runs roughly north and south. In the south, roughly near the base of the thumb, lies a little town called Carentan. And at the top of the thumb, the strategic port of Cherbourg. A roadway known as the N13 wends its way north from Carentan in the south to Cherbourg in the north. Now, halfway up that road is a little country town called Saint-Mère-Église. You may have heard of it. Ironically, the town was made famous by a comedian. You may recall in The Longest Day, the movie, there is a riveting scene when Red Buttons is hanging by his snag parachute from a church tower and watches helplessly and horrified as a number of his buddies are mowed down the street below, as the deafening church bells of Saint-Mère-Église ring endlessly on above his head. A replica of Button's parachute hangs from that church tower today, 65 years later, still attracting tourists and their insatiable quest for souvenirs. Many of the tourists weren't even born when the tragedy took place. More incredibly, many are even aware of who was fighting whom. In the souvenir shops and even a number of the war museums of Normandy, the once seemingly invincible Nazi war machine is often referred to by a euphemism, the enemy. France's neighbor Germany, of course, has undergone a soul-searching epiphany and is now a vital NATO ally and a principal Eurozone trading partner. The center of our story lies just a short distance away in the Cotentin. Our story happened in a place not celebrated in film, not commercialized in souvenir shops. Just off the Carentan-Cherbourg Road, about 6 kilometers south of Saint-Mère-Église and about 7 miles inland from Utah Beach, lies a little town called Yéville. Town is actually too grandiose to describe Yéville. Petit village is what the French would call it, now known to only a few stolid Norman farmers and their black and white polka-dotted Ben and Jerry ice cream type cows. Foreign place, I thought, forgotten place. Vivid only perhaps in the memories of the rapidly dwindling group of those who fought there. But on June 6, 1944, the petit village of Yéville loomed large in the battle plans of Chafe, strategic headquarters Allied expeditionary force. It was a critical link in the operation named Overlord, make or break Allied invasion of the European continent, a plan which would at long last hopefully relieve Stalin's beleaguered forces on the Eastern Front and the battle-weary Allied forces which were bogged down in Italy. A plan that would long last penetrate Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's impregnable 2,400-mile Atlantic wall stretching from Norway all the way down to the Pyrenees. In the pre-dawn hours of that historic moment, Yéville, the anonymous village, now slated to become General Maxwell Taylor's headquarters, Normandy, was alive with action, with life, with death. And our story is of one of the many unsung units of the Second World War. It is a story of the 3rd Auxiliary Surgical Group and their rendezvous at Yéville, behind the beaches of Normandy with the legions of the legendary German Field Marshal, an opponent who they'd met before. And it's a story of a selfless few who bore up under that anguish, but with their humanity intact. Rommel, 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 Churchill had exclaimed. What else matters? Beating him. Nick Atkinson, in his seminal work on the North African campaign, An Army at Dawn, perhaps best describes Rommel, quote, like most of history's successful commanders, Rommel had the uncanny ability to dominate the minds of his adversaries. A much decorated infantryman in the Great War, that's the World War I, he rocketed from lieutenant colonel to field marshal in 4 years. Given command of Hitler's personal bodyguard in 1939, command of the 7th Panzer Division in its dash across the lowlands in France all the way down to the coast of Spain in 1940, was rewarded with command of the German forces in Libya in 1941. There, he gained the fame and sobriquet, the Desert Fox, when he drove the numerically superior British 8th Army all the way back into Egypt to the outskirts of Cairo. So as a reward, Rommel would ultimately be given command of the German defenses in Western Europe. Of course, he would eventually take his life in 1945 in an attempted plot on Hitler. But in 1942, Rommel was perhaps the apogee of his career in Tunisia during the Battle of the Kasserine Pass. And it was there, immediately following this battle, as the Allied forces began their counteroffensive at a place called Maganasi that the 3rd Auxiliary Surgical Group had first encountered. Now, the 3rd Auxiliary Surgical Group was affectionately dubbed the 3rd Auxers. They were formed at Fort Houston in 1942, only 6 months after Pearl Harbor, just as the Japanese overran the Philippines, and shortly after General MacArthur had escaped to Australia, leaving General Wainwright in command during the infamous Bataan Death March. Little did the Auxers know they would ultimately endure a death march of their own. On the Eastern Front, as the 3rd Auxers were being formed, the Russian armies were reeling in disarray as German panzers thrust rapidly toward Moscow and Leningrad in the north, and Stalingrad, Romania, and the rich Baku oil fields in the south. It's a portentous time to be born. 3rd Auxers were a unique experiment. Their mission was to provide surgery right up in the front lines of battle. But they had precious little guidance to go on. There's only one book written on the subject. It was called Field Surgery in Total War, written by a man who was from New Zealand named Joly during the Spanish Civil War. Very outdated. He had devised a system of layered field hospitals and surgical triage called a 3-point forward system pattern, which was eventually adopted by the 3rd Auxers, but significant modifications were required in order to adapt this system to modern warfare. Unfortunately, those modifications would be paid for in the lives of many of the finest surgeons and physicians in our country. The team would go on, however, to save countless American lives in Africa and Europe. Perhaps their finest hour, they would not only distinguish themselves in the Battle of the Bulge at Bastogne, but thereafter on the death march of the 101st Airborne prisoners from a place called Schubin in Poland back to Nuremberg in Germany in the bitter winter and spring of 1945. In Tunisia at Makanasi, continuous surgery was performed by the Auxers, often for days on end, without break, often with the aid of chemical stimulants. Significant to our story, many were often bombed out of their surgeries and buried under falling debris. But there's no remembrance whatsoever in Africa, none I could find, of anything that they did there. Regrettably, Magnasi proved to be a foreshadowing of things to come in Normandy, where the Auxers were to face Rommel again, this time in bucolic Yéville. But this time, nature and faulty Allied intelligence conspired to confront the Allied armies with something worse, another foe, the Hedgerows of Normandy. It was a foe ironically described by the great French novelist Henri de Balzac. In the 19th century, Balzac would write of the Hedgerows of Normandy as follows, quote, "The peasants from time immemorial had raised a bank of earth about each field." They were trying to separate their fields out, very proprietary, Norman farmers. Raised a bank of earth about each field, forming a flat-topped ridge 2 meters in height, with beech trees, oaks, and chestnut trees growing upon the summit. The ridge or mound planted in this wise, said Balzac, is called a hedge, and as the long branches of the trees which grow upon it almost always project across the road, they make a great arbor overhead. The roads themselves, shut in by clay banks, said Balzac, in this melancholy way, are not unlike the moats of fortresses, end quote. Tragically, those in charge of Allied intelligence in the Normandy campaign were not schooled in the 19th century French novel. None of them had read Balzac. From the air, the hedgerows of Yéville looked to them like the small hedges of the English countryside, which intrepid fox hunters scaled with relative ease as they rode to the familiar cries of tally-ho. Intelligence gaffe was to prove deadly to the unfortunate 3rd Auxers, who sat nervously in CG-4A gliders, swooping in behind Utah Beach in the dark pre-dawn hours of June 6, 1944. Disastrous gliding lander scene is perhaps best described in a very recent book called D-Day by Anthony Bevour, an Englishman, from the vantage point of a Pathfinder paratroop already on the ground in that fateful morning. Pathfinders were sent in around midnight on D-Day. The troops were scheduled to land at 7. Pathfinders were to light landing zones for the gliders that came in and the paratroops that came in, who came in around 2 hours later. This is what Bevour's Pathfinder describes this scene as, quote, "At the appointed moment, signal lamps were switched on. We could hear the sounds of planes in the distance, and then No sounds at all. This was followed by a series of swishing noises. Adding to the swelling crescendo of sounds were the tearing of branches, trees, followed by loud crashes, intermittent screams. Many gliders overshot the field, landed in the woods, while others crashed into farmhouses and stone walls. Gliders had been loaded with jeeps, anti-tank guns, and other weapons too large to drop by parachute. Cargo was strapped down, secured to plywood floors. Pilots and glider troops alike had only canvas and light wood to protect them. In a moment, the field was complete. It was complete chaos, with gliders plowing in all directions. Equipment broke away, catapulted through the front of the plane when it hit the ground, often crushing the pilots. Bodies and bullets were scattered through the length of the field. Some of the glider troops were actually impaled by the splintered wood of the fragile machines, end quote. The Auxers were to land in just such CG-4A gliders, with just such cargo, and more often than not, with similar outcomes. Now, Eisenhower's battle plan called for the 4th Infantry Division and others to attack Utah Beach. The 82nd Airborne and the 101st Airborne would be dropped to the rear to seize the beach exits. The areas behind the beaches were inundated. They were inundated with water, flooded by Rommel, but there were causeways over them. The 101st and 82nd Airborne were dropped behind the lines with the hope that they would secure those causeways over the beaches. The Auxers were to be glided in with the 101st behind the lines. Eisenhower had already postponed D-Day from June 5th due to high winds, choppy seas, and heavy rain. As the fateful day, June 6th, approached, the winds were still high, seas were still choppy, but a short period of clearing was expected. After deliberating, Ike felt that there was just enough clearing to risk it, delivered his classic let it rip, and after seeing the 101st Airborne off at Greenham Common that night, retired to his room, composed a letter accepting full responsibility for total defeat. One of the primary drop zones of the 101st was to be Yaville. The 3rd Auxes were to land there beside the paratroops to provide frontline surgical field stations. It was a daunting assignment to begin with, but given the deteriorating weather conditions of the day in the pre-dawn hours of June 6th, it became even more so. Ike's short periods of clearing proved to be just that, short. Pathfinders went earlier to light the way, but as we know, combat troops know only too well, the best laid plans of general often become worthless in actual combat. So it was on June 6th, that 1944, planes carrying the 101st and 101st and 82nd Airborne paratroops lost their way in the dark as clouds shrouded the way. Many of the flares intended to light up the drop zones could not be seen. Many others couldn't be even lit because of ground interference. C-47s carrying paratroopers instinctively took evasive action in order to avoid flak. This proved tragic. This was strictly against orders, but it resulted in chaos in the way the troops were dropped. A number flew too low, causing paratroops to self-destruct as they hit the ground after being forced to jump at only 500 feet. A number of paratroops dropped into Rommel's flooded zones behind the beaches and were drowned or marooned. Parachutes, of course, came entangled in trees, and many doomed paratroopers hung there like shooting gallery targets to be shot at by German snipers, who riddled some mercilessly, attacked others with flamethrowers. So as dawn broke on D-Day, Allied airborne forces were spread out along the entire breadth of the Côte d'Antin, behind the beaches, separated from one another hardly according to any plan. The fighting that night has been described as pitiless on both sides, the most vicious fighting of the whole war on the Western Front. It was into this chaotic inferno that the 3rd Auxers gliders crash-landed in and around Yaville at roughly H-4 on D-Day. H-4 means H hour being 7 a.m. minus when troops were to land on the beach, -4. Among the glider fatalities that morning was Brigadier General Don F. Pratt, the Assistant Divisional Commander of the 101st Airborne. Across the field from Pratt's glider, however, were those carrying 2 unsung 3rd Auxer surgeons in charge of a team that would go on to distinguish themselves both in Yaville and throughout the rest of the war in Europe, culminating in that POW march. Major Albert J. Crandall and Captain Saul Dworkin. These are their stories. The team's assignment was set up a surgical station at a large 400-year-old French farmhouse called the Chateau Colombière in Yéville, and to do first priority surgery from the start behind the lines. Captain Dworkin, a surgeon from St. Louis, was separated into a different glider from Major Crandall for the sake of team survival. Crandall's story was told to one Clifford Graves, MD, a surgeon with the 3rd Officers, and appears in a book entitled Frontline Surgeons. The captain's story was related in a letter home, later reprinted in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. As the officers in charge of the mission, both of their stories were likewise reported by them in detail in a formal report 7 weeks later addressed to the commanding officer of the 3rd Auxiliary Surgical Group, filed on July 29, 1944. It's on these revealing documents that the bulk of the rest of the story is based. The tale of Captain Dworkin begins just after Ike bid Godspeed to the troops, and the flight took off from Aldermaston Airfield, west of London. Our personnel were widely distributed among the fighting troops, he wrote, so that I found myself in a glider containing a trailer load of ammunition. Took off from England at 1 a.m., the beach invasion being scheduled for 7 a.m., landed at 2:30 a.m. It was H-4. They were behind German lines, about 7 miles inland from Utah Beach. It was a misty rain and rough weather on the way over, wrote the captain. When we hit the coast of France, we were caught in searchlights, peppered with flak, and even small arms fire as we flew very low. What was missing most sitting in there in that glider was a parachute. Of course, somehow or other, this is a great safety fetish, even though at the height in which we were flying, you wouldn't get a chute functioning in time. Began to thank God when we finally cut loose from the tow ship, but soon learned that this was premature, and trying to avoid a field where our glider pilot would see firing, we crash landed into the hedgerows. I careened around like a billiard ball, received no serious injury, he wrote. He later realized that he had received severe contusions and abrasions. There was machine gun fire all around. We scrambled out with the injured into a hedgerow ditch, and things had cooled down somewhat. We went about giving plasma right out in the field. Never again, wrote the captain, will we neglect to take along those important pieces of glider medical equipment, a gun and a few hand grenades. We never knew when enemy snipers might open fire from a hedgerow. Major Crandall's tale begins in the short flight from Saint-Sauveur to Vicon and over Saint-Mère-Église. He likewise ran through a heavy anti-aircraft barrage and tried to orient himself through the din. He had an exact mental picture of the countryside, and he recognized Rommel's deadly inundated areas behind the beach without difficulty. Moments later, flak eased up, warning light went on, and as it did so, another glider shot out of the darkness, crossed not 20 yards away, sheared off a wing, and pancaked heavily. Major's glider veered away, skimmed over the trees, came in for a perfect landing, but like Captain Dworkin's glider, was unable to stop before hitting those hedgerows. Major bounced forward, crashed through the hull, catapulted 20 feet out onto the field. Remarkably, like Captain Dworkin, hurt, not disabled. When he scrambled from the wreckage, the first thing he noticed was death-like silence. No roar of engines, no barks of guns, no whistle of wind, just a void of silence. Silence of the night. He reared himself. Was he the only survivor? What seemed an eternity of silence, a voice came from the middle of the field. I'm hurt. Anybody help me? Man crying out for help was Mike Murphy. He was the pilot of the glider that preceded Crandall's. Both of his legs were badly broken. His passenger, Brigadier General Don F. Pratt, the assistant commander of the division, had died instantly, an enormous strategic blow to the Allied high command. The night had started badly. Now let me pause here for just a moment in the tale of Crandall and Dworkin. The story of Murphy's glider is one of those strange anomalies of war worth relating. Curiously, neither Murphy nor the glider nor Pratt were supposed to be where they were. Happenstance, as it does in war, brought them all together for that fatal landing. Murphy was supposed to be training pilots back in England. Pratt was originally scheduled to lead the seaborne units onto the beach. And the glider they should have been in, well, it was now back number 45th in the line. They were number 1. That all happened this way. Both Murphy and Pratt were macho personalities. They talked their way into flying in behind the lines ahead of the troops. in order to see action earlier. Now, Mike Murphy was the most experienced glider pilot in the United States Army Air Force. In civilian life, he'd been a wing walker. He was a daredevil guy who performed at air shows. He also was the first guy to put landing gear on the top and the bottom of a plane and land in an air show upside down. Incredible character, Murphy. General Pratt would be succeeded on his death as commander of the 101st by General McAuliffe, who you may remember became a legend for applying nuts to the Germans at Bastogne. This guy was a rugged leader who craved action early on, would have parachuted in, wasn't jump qualified, and so he was glided in with his Jeep and with his adjutant. Third piece of this incredible puzzle, the original Fighting Falcon CG-4A glider had been donated by the school children in a place called Greenville, Michigan, where it was manufactured by the Gibson Electric Company, a refrigerator manufacturer. Kids had raised $72,000 in a war bond campaign, for which they were awarded the Distinguished Service Award. Glider then they donated was then dubbed the Fighting Falcon. That's the symbol of the 101st Airborne, and it was supposed to lead the charge on D-Day, but fate intervened all around here. First, Murphy changed gliders on June 3rd in order to take advantage of a new crash protection device called the Griswold nose. So the original Fighting Falcon, the one donated by the kids, was moved back to 45th. It would later land without incident, but without Pratt and Murphy in it. The next twist in the tale proved fatal. I believe it was Mark Twain who once said, "I can take care of my enemies, but God protect me from my friends." Unbeknownst to Mike Murphy, the general staff had ordered armored plating installed under the pilot and co-pilot seat under the general's Jeep in order to protect against flak and ground fire. The glider, of course, was thus overloaded and caused it to crash into the hedgerows at an even greater speed than the others, forcing the Jeep and the ammunition and supplies to lurch forward, crushing the general to death. Murphy wound up hanging half in and half out of the smashed Griswold nose, his torso restrained by a seatbelt. They were behind German lines now. German tanks were poised just above the hedgerow. Two German soldiers with flashlights and guns drawn descended from the tanks, approached the glider, entered, poked around. Murphy played dead, prayed. Germans bought the Death Act and left when they were apparently called back. The third officers were hiding in the field in a hedgerow ditch, now cautiously approached the glider, took charge of Murphy. Splintering his legs, began their triage in the open field, but suddenly both Major Crandall and Captain Dworkin were suddenly aware of the sound of an empty bottle tumbling through the air. They ducked. It was the sound of a mortar shell, one that was become all too familiar to them during the remainder of the campaign. It was a dull thud, and again an eerie silence. A paratrooper crawled over to investigate. "This one's a dud," he said, but they were relieved. But they were out in the middle of a field, and obviously in the line of fire, the Germans had a beat on them. Realizing it would be suicidal to stay on, because they were in the line of fire, Crandall ordered the wounded to be carried to a hedgerow ditch at the end of the field, and there they would lie together with the wounded in total silence until the first light of dawn, in dread all the time that an uncontrollable moan from more serious of the wounded would alert German patrols, but none did. The crack of dawn, the major took off, took his bearings. He was on the high ground east of Carentan Semi-Riggs Highway, and the H-13 Yaville would be straight north. He organized a reconnaissance party, advanced cautiously, but caution wasn't enough as they immediately ran into another German patrol, scurried for cover, ducked out of sight. Meanwhile, at the first light of dawn, Captain Dworkin also set out, but separately for the Chateau Colombier. In the early morning, on our way up in the Jeep, he wrote, "We were sniped at a number of times, so we went on a very fast clip. From almost every tree," he said, "it seemed flapping in the wind. There dangled silk parachutes." Now, of course, at this time, just up the N13 at Saint-Mary-Église, Red Button's character was already dangling from the church tower, and a number of his buddies caught in the trees had become target practice for the Germans. In the distance, Dworkin could now hear our naval bombardment opening up on the beaches. The LSTs were about to launch. The bloodbath, later so graphically depicted in Saving Private Ryan in those first scenes, was just about to begin. When the German patrols finally drifted away, Crandall, too, was able at last to set out for the Chateau Colombier. "Dog bark. There's a dog. There are people," he said. "I've got to find out where I am." Across the field came to a farmhouse. The house was dark. Crandall knocked. To his great surprise, his knock was answered almost immediately. The farmer, fully dressed, stood in the door. "Entrez, mon capitaine," he said. "Votre ami est déjà ici. Come in. Your friend's already here." Followed a monologue in which Crandall gathered that another American was already in the house. "Un blessé grave, mon capitaine. Serious injury, my captain." Casually, instinctively, Crandall reached for his medical pouch, followed the farmer to a back room. It was obviously the best room in the house. Fire was roaring in the fireplace, and the bed had been pushed close to the source of heat. Casually sat on the bed, his shoes were off, he had his one foot in a bucket of steaming water. And a beautiful farm girl busied herself putting hot compresses on the American's slightly swollen ankle. "Hello, Sergeant, what's the matter?" "Oh, nothing much, Major, I just sprained an ankle." "Can you walk?" "Not very well, sir." "Well, I'll get a jeep for you, son, as soon as I can." "Sir, if it's all the same to you, never mind the jeep. I'll be all right here. This isn't a bad spot." Pointed the girl. Crandall turned to the farmer. "Où est Yéville? Where's Yéville?" "Oh, mon capitaine, c'est là-bas. It's right over there. You can't miss it." Crandall struck out for the Chateau Colombier, reluctantly leaving the unfortunate wounded warrior who was stayed at the farmhouse with the French farmer's beautiful daughter. These things happen in war, he thought. Why in hell don't they happen to me? It was lighter now, and the village seemed to be undefended. So the major selected 5 paratroopers to take possession of the chateau. The building stood off by itself, apparently deserted, but the 400-year-old farmhouse would soon prove to be an inviting trap. Shot rang out from the stable. 2 scouts edged forward while others covered. They reached the stable and then the courtyard and entered the house. While Crandall lay in the ditch, yet another shot rang out. The paratrooper collapsed. The seemingly peaceful chateau was not a place safe for surgery. Yet, this was the place designated. It was the only place in the vicinity where surgery could be established under cover. Reinforcements arrived. The house was sprayed with bullets. Paratroopers entered. They found only a French family. No further fire. For the moment, all seemed secure. French occupants welcomed the major and captain, but with open arms, but cautioned them that snipers were in the vicinity and they were deadly. And just as Crandall assured them that they need have no fear, another shot rang out. The man who had been standing in the courtyard only moments before wheeled and fell. The situation was obviously far more perilous than the major had imagined, but there was no alternative as paratroops, the casualties and so forth had now begun to pour in. In spite of the paratroopers' efforts, the team would come under intermittent fire for the entire 4 days the chateau was in use. Situation quite typical of the fighting of Normandy at the time. Snipers were everywhere. It was impossible to dislodge them. Well, as much of the surgical equipment had been lost in the clouds and the bad drops, Crandall and Dworkin now began to improvise. They set up an operating room in the milk house, which had a concrete floor, large windows, and a pump with the spring water. Living room was converted into a shock ward. Kitchen into a minor operating room. Courtyard became a reception station. The team improvised litters from window casings, feed troughs, kitchen tables, sawed-off ladders, fired up the huge stove, boiled their instruments. At H+3, only 3 hours after the Allied troops hit the beaches, they were already able to operate. It was an astonishing tribute to their mastery of the heretofore undoable. It was not only frontline surgery, it was frontline surgery behind enemy lines. That had never been done before. Fittingly, Mike Murphy, Crandall's first case, not only survived, first casualty, 101st Airborne, he returned to the States. Round-the-clock work now began. The chateau, writes Captain Dworkin, we set up the first Allied hospital invasion of Europe. 4 days and nights, we didn't sleep, keeping awake on medical stimulants such as hexadrine. Now, the 101st Airborne had suffered badly from scattered drops and faulty intelligence, just as had the 82nd. Less than half the medical company reached Yéville on D-Day, and less than 10% of the parachute bundles carrying vital medical supplies were recovered. Yet, remarkably, the work went on at full speed. Crandall, Dworkin, and their fellow surgeons never stopped. 6 weeks later, on July 29, 1944, Crandall and Dworkin would file a mission report with the commanding officer of 3rd Auxiliary Group. It was, of course, a standard form of document, but this one was far from standard. In it, they would detail in dry Army command language amounts and kinds of equipment used, supplies used, the number of wounded treated, 2,070 by June 26, by the way, before they moved on, and details of the events upon landing in the dark. But tucked away, almost unnoticed in the report, on the following 3 sentences, which may never again see the light of day, but which speak volumes. Quote, a German medical unit consisting of 2 medical officers and 25 enlisted men had been captured and was brought to the station in the afternoon of D1, that's D-Day. They were given tents with additional equipment. They were set up outside the chateau in the enclosed courtyard. This unit was able to treat enemy minor wounded casualties before transfer of their major surgical cases to the operating theaters in the chateau. Before transfer of their major surgical cases, operating theaters in the chateau. What? There it was, unnoticed, amidst the bloodbath, the atrocities, and the Götterdämmerung of that dark night in Normandy, in an old French farmhouse beneath the gnarled hedgerows, shone a beacon of humanity. Not highlighted, wasn't underlined italics or bold type. It was merely noted perfunctorily in an otherwise routine statistical report, as if to say, of course we were operating on German wounded. Took a Hippocratic oath to do that. Nothing unusual about that. Why make a big deal out of it? But to me, those 3 short sentences speak volumes. On the evening of D+3, the operating room in the Chateau Yéville was going full blast. There was heavy fighting now on the causeways behind the Utah beachhead. Ambulances had begun to arrive incessantly. Harrowing battle conditions would continue to haunt the surgical unit. The failure to immediately secure the causeways over Utah Beach had left the inland units of the 101st and 82nd, such as those around Yéville, not only behind enemy lines, but isolated there. At 11 o'clock that night, Major Crandall, in a hurried triage, quickly assessed the abdominal cases, selected the worst one. There had been no rest for 3 days. Start with the kidney, was Crandall's thought. Large clamp, he said, holding out his hand, but at that moment he paused. Familiar roar of low-flying planes filled the air. By this time, the pause had become reflexive. It was a sound that was to haunt both of the officers for many years to come. Planes passed directly overhead, followed by the ominous whistle of bombs. The earth shook, massive buildings shuddered. A beam crashed from the ceiling, carrying bricks and plaster with it, crushing surgical personnel and patients alive. Lights went out, walls caved in, windows were blown to bits. One entire wing of the building became a 60-foot crater. Scores were buried under the debris, many crushed. Men who had talked lightheartedly a moment before were now moaning, praying for deliverance. The surgical team was badly shaken. Dworkin and Crandall survived with painful cuts and bruises. The hours the 2 of them stumbled through the wreckage trying to tell the living from the dead. Not until daybreak was it possible to take account. They had lost 8 dead, 14 wounded. As it turned out, the surgery at Chateau Colombier was one of the worst catastrophes to befall a medical installation during the entire war. Crandall and Dworkin, with unsung valor characteristic of their team, now made adjustments. We immediately set up in an adjoining field in tents, reports Captain Dworkin. We continued operating. In his letter, he alludes to this too, almost casually, as if it were routine. Of course, it was anything but routine. It was a selfless act carried out in the front line of battle by men without weapons, armed only with minimal surgical tools, a dwindling supply of anesthetics, a fulsome complement of human courage. Many more American lives would be saved that night and during the many days and nights that followed as the team continued to operate out in the open field without protection, often isolated behind enemy lines, often under continual bombardment. Without a break, 96 hours. Afterwards, they would continue to operate in the field under tents, losing some of the wounded, but saving many, until they were finally relieved on July 11, 1944. Allies finally broke through. Lamentably, the world might never know how an unsung, isolated surgical team behind German lines saved countless numbers of those citizen soldiers who Stephen Ambrose would glorify in print. Marvelous book, Citizen Soldier. Many of you may have read it. Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks were immortalized in the films of Saving Private Ryan, the docudrama Band of Brothers. These are not professional soldiers. Their actions were never romanticized. They were plain but hardly ordinary citizens who took on Rommel's best in the middle of a fog-shrouded night that had started so badly and prevailed against all odds, and remarkably with their humanity intact. The 101st, of course, would go on to perform gloriously at Market Garden and Bastogne. Many, including Major Crandall and Captain Dworkin, would ultimately fall into German hands. When the unit was surrounded by the elite Panzer Grenadiers during the Battle of the Bulge, tragically, half of the 101st Airborne prisoners who were captured with them, including many who had fought alongside them in Yeville, would die on a 600-mile forced march from Schuben, Poland, into Germany. The heroic actions of Captain Dworkin on that particular march is related in detail in that very same book, Frontline Surgeons, would become legendary among his fellow airborne troops. In a compelling introduction to his book, The War, Ken Burns notes with alarm that 1,000 veterans of the Second World War are dying every day. Thus we're losing, said Burns, a direct connection to the deeds of that unusually reticent generation, end quote. He's right. My uncle, Captain Shale, his legal name was Saul Dworkin, the recipient of the V-mail letters I had written for my grandparents, was awarded the Purple Heart, among numerous other medals, for his wounds and bravery in action, but reluctant to talk much about the war. Miraculously survived the death march, and after being liberated by our army in Nuremberg, returned to his wife and infant daughter Jennifer, who had been but a newborn when he left. She was now 4.5. Devoted the rest of his life in St. Louis to saving civilian lives, both in general and surgical practice. Lived a full life to age 71, probably one of the last of a breed of non-specialists who did everything from complex surgery, general practice, dispensing pharmaceuticals. Took the Hippocratic Oath as seriously as any man who ever practiced the general art. Thankfully, his practice days were over before the advent of the HMO and the explosion of the medical malpractice phenomenon. He was as selfless in private practice as he'd been at Yeville, and on the death march, often treating less affluent patients for no remuneration at all. The letters from the survivors of the death march, both captors and captured alike, reveal that remarkably, though half-starved on the march, he would treat not only 101st Airborne wounded, but German civilians wounded in bombing attacks just as well, just as he had treated German wounded at the Chateau Colombière. Not every good deed goes unpunished. During one bombing raid in Nuremberg, he was buried alive and fortunately dug out as he was about to breathe his last by one of his guards who admired what he had been doing on the march. His letter about the D-Day landing in Normandy, though cherished by our family, has no doubt long since been relegated by the St. Louis Post-Dispatch to its morgue dustbin. His and Crandall's joint report to the surgical command containing that extraordinary vestige of humanity is no doubt buried deep in some military archive. But I had a rare opportunity to explore that direct connection to his wartime deeds that Burns talks about. On our 50th wedding anniversary, I was presented by my wife with one of the only 225 copies ever printed of that book, Frontline Surgeons. I devoured every word of it. And it was a map of the area behind Utah Beach, and there, looming large, was a little village of Yeville. I've never found it, hardly ever found it on any other map. I'd never known about Yeville, where it was. I'd only know of the Chateau. I did not know of the Chateau Colombière. I only knew that an event took place somewhere in that area before I read the Frontline Surgeons. Sketchy details. I now vowed to go there, now that I knew the place and knew the details. I'm going to find the place where my uncle's glider landed 65 years ago, and the spot where his unit, surgery under fire, was performed, even if both had been turned into French gas stations by now, as no doubt they had. It was a sacred place to me. I had to find it. Nearest large town was Bayeux. Susie and I started out from there with a copy of the Frontline Surgeons map in hand one fall morning in 2008. We're following our GPS to Yeville. We got nearer. Susie warned me not to expect anything significant, trying desperately to prepare me for decompression 65 years ago, she said. Gayville's a tiny place on the map. Things have changed in 65 years. People come, people go. Memories are short, especially with what's happened in Europe, 65 years. And you yourself pointed it out to me that phrases like the enemy are now used in describing what even happened way back then. Euphemisms, I think you call them. What you're looking for is a remembrance. Some miraculous symbol, acts of valor on a heroic day in a small corner of the earth. It's not there. Not there. So don't hope for it. Those acts have not been reproduced or romanticized in films like The Longest Day, red buttons hanging from a church tower at Saint-Mary-Église. They never will be. Look, except for 225 copies of Frontline Surgeons, the events haven't even been written about, and it took me 20 years and over a dozen professional researchers to find that book for our 50th anniversary. So don't expect miracles. You're not going to find them. It's a pipe dream. Of course, she was trying hard to cushion the fall that was sure to come, and of course, she was right. Nevertheless, I said, we've come all this way. I've got to find that place. It's sacred to me. Whatever. We passed quietly through Carentan. The roads now narrow. We veered off the main road at a place called Saint-Côme-de-Mont. We approached the village of Vierville. We were directed onto an even smaller road. After what seemed like an eternity, signs to Gayville at long last began to appear. By this time, the roads had narrowed even further. Most of the roads were dirt roads by now. The hedgerows that Balzac had so graphically described now framed every roadway. They were just as beautiful, but every bit as foreboding as the classic 19th century novelists had depicted them. Many arched so high over the road that their branches met halfway across. They were indeed forming arbors. The road was like moats. Ordinarily, it would have been a picturesque sight, but knowing what instruments of death they had been 65 years ago, they now appeared to me thick, gnarled, impenetrable. In reading and rereading Frontline Surgeons, I had lived vicariously through those disastrous 101st Airborne landings on details. I disliked hedgerows, those gigantic gnarled hedges looming as they did out of earthen dikes 4 to 5 feet high, had once turned this picturesque French countryside into a death trap for Americans. We were passing through rich but sparsely populated farmland. There are only a few houses now. The GPS took us down a road where there are no houses at all, just hedgerows, pasture, cows, sheep, then even more of them. And another thing, silence. An almost eerie silence. For a moment, I thought of the void of silence that Crandall had experienced after crash landing here in the pre-dawn hours of June 6, 1944. The black monument rose suddenly, jutting out of a small clearing in the dirt road, ringed nearby by the ubiquitous hedgerows. First sighted the marble monument was being admired by a herd of well-fed milk cows, moved contentedly by a flock of white sheep with the black faces that made noise like an antique car horn. That's all the cacophony that broke the stillness of that bucolic scene, all except for me, crying out, "Oh my God," as I stared in disbelief at the inscription on the monument just below the white enamel Screaming Eagle, the 101st Airborne. In tribute to the 101st Airborne Division, who established here at Châteaubriand the first Allied surgical hospital on Normandy soil, June 6, 1944. Transfixed, stunned in that bucolic silence. It was a God after all, I said. That flash of a second, I felt closer to him. But even more remarkable than the monument itself was this. On the ground beneath it stood a container of red flowers, freshly watered, obviously tended. We remained there, mute, rooted to the ground. Here's the exact place I realized. In this open field, my uncle, with the rest of that unsung surgical team, performed life-saving surgery. Under fire, they were bombed out of their makeshift surgery at the Châteaubriand. So this was a sacred piece of ground. Here, at risk of imminent death, they had saved myriads of wounded American troops, lost some for whom this ground had become a temporary cemetery. A cemetery every bit as sacred as Arlington or the American Cemetery at Omaha Beach, which are visited annually by thousands. Life and death had hung in the balance in this place. It had hung here precariously in the hands of surgeons like my uncle, who went without sleep for over 96 hours, staying awake on hexadrine, as casualties poured in from some of the fiercest battles of the war, battles that would ultimately determine the success or failure of the greatest seaborne invasion in history, battles which raged about them all up and down the coast of Normandy, and when this place was behind enemy lines and isolated. And someone had remembered. For 65 years, someone had remembered their guts under fire, their heroism, planting and preserving fresh flowers at the base of this monument. Whoever they were even tending to it yesterday, or maybe even this morning, before we arrived. But who? The realization was almost too much to assimilate. Remained there in disbelief, unable to speak for a long time. It was a moment of the most profound empathy with an event and an unknown kindred spirit, but one who must be somewhere nearby. I had to find someone to tell him why I'd come, to express my and my own family's eternal gratitude, to find that person. Perhaps you'd find them at the Chapter Colombier. Drove about 100 yards down the short private road perpendicular to the monument, where the monument stood toward the chateau. As I looked up at the hedgerows framing the road, I could picture the parachutes caught in the trees. My uncle had described them when he had driven down this very road. Now I could visualize the very real scene he described. How many paratroops had died right here, I wondered. How many teenage kids had hung right here like red buttons, helpless, horrified under fire as they could even land. How many became target practice for snipers? And how many survived or saved by that gutsy team of surgeons? At the end of the road, about 100 yards down from the monument, there it was, Chateau Colombier. It had been rebuilt, but it was just as it looked in the pictures before it had been bombed out, pictures in frontline surgeons. Just a large cement farmhouse. There was no one there. The family which owned it happened to be away. So we ventured out to find the nearest house. I had to know. We finally found a house. I rang the bell. Housewife answered, invited us in, explained why we'd come, French. She invited us in, immediately phoned the mayor. Within minutes, the mayor arrived on her bike, bolted through the door, threw her arms around me. I knew your uncle, she exclaimed out of breath. Come to the office so I can show you the photo album. There's a ceremony at the monument every June 6th. I have pictures, you'll see. Clearly, she was the one. The books which she had in her office were thick, or many volumes, in fact, filled with photos of the ceremonies held every June 6th at the monument. And there were inscriptions of gratitude from hundreds of veterans and their families who had attended the ceremonies over the years. Last were dated as recently as June 2008, just a couple of months before we were there. There were military ceremonies. Many of the speakers were civilian. Now, their time in the military had long since passed. The mayor knew them all. A number of the veterans had come back for many years, although many had died with the passing of time. Last were in their 90s. She wasn't sure how much longer many would be able to come, if any. As it turns out, she didn't know my uncle. She had me confuse the family of another veteran. It didn't matter. She was overjoyed that we were there. And, of course, she asked that we come back. Of course, we did. I was privileged to participate in that ceremony just this last June 6, 2010. Speak there about my uncle's escapades, what he did during the war there. Lay a wreath together with Jennifer, his daughter, the newborn when he'd left, and my first cousin. In that same memorable introduction to his docudrama of the war, Ken Burns quotes the renowned war correspondent Eric Sevareid, addressing an American audience just after the war. Quote, "Only the soldier really lives the war," end quote, he told his audience. "A correspondent may share the soldier's outward life and dangers, but cannot share his inner life. That is why, in a certain sense, you and your sons from the war will forever be strangers." End quote. As a youngster, during my years as a scrivener for my maternal grandparents, I can vividly recall hearing my grandmother cry herself to sleep night after night during the long hiatus and correspondence after Bastogne, during the Death March. The futile letters that I wrote for them during that period were, of course, never received by him, never answered. They never knew what he experienced at Gay Deal. Fortunately, they would never know of the agonizing nights after he returned to St. Louis, and when he would wake up screaming as the airmail planes flew over the house on their way to Chicago. And no doubt Sevareid was right. His inner thoughts during those terrifying days and nights in Europe, France, Germany, Poland, be forever a stranger to us. But the heroism and the common humanity took place in that tiny bucolic village in the early dawn hours of June 6, 1944. Well, those clearly live on. My life-changing experience behind the beaches of Normandy had opened my eyes to a small place that is never forgotten. Opened my mind to a time that will indeed live on in the minds of the villagers of Yéville as they pass the memory of those acts of valor and uncommon humanity performed by that courageous band of surgeons down to generations yet to come. And though the church bells that ring in Yéville have not been immortalized as have those in Saint-Mary-Église, when they do ring, they ring true. Thank you. How many of you have been to Normandy? I know Barbara said, you have. Look at those hands out here. I'd like to hear you tell me what you remember of Normandy most. Any of you that had your hands up. What do you remember of your trip to Normandy? Anybody? Yeah.
The height of the hill at Omaha Beach.
The height of the hills at Omaha Beach. I think Barbara Hochberg, you still here, Barbara? Are you here?
She left.
I think she left. Okay. She just went there and climbed that very hill. You remember that? Did you go to Pont du Hoc, which was at the Rangers scaled? It's almost vertical. Were you there? I see you shaking your head. Yeah. Yes.
Remember several things. First of all, the magnificent World War II museum, which featured not only the French, the American, but also the German flags in the front of the building.
Right.
The other thing I remember very strongly, very clearly, are the cemeteries of the French, of the Americans and the British, which were kept immaculately clean and were covered with flowers, and yet when you walk over to the German cemetery, it was absolutely filthy.
Was it really? I'm surprised to hear that. But that's an interesting observation. How many of you have been to the American cemetery at Omaha Beach? That's kept beautifully and absolutely remarkable. When we were there were French school children there, a number of them visiting and being told all about the history of Normandy, which was quite interesting. Yeah, there were a bunch of hands up. Yes?
Two points. One, what's fascinating to me is this area happens to be one of the few places in the world where Americans can go and actually feel love.
Be loved, yes. Yes?
Those people have not forgotten.
Refreshing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The people in Saint-Mary-Église have never forgotten the guys who landed there.
No question.
They know most of them like me. And it's fascinating.
Yeah, it is a very refreshing thing. I'm glad you brought that up. There aren't many places in this world where you can go where Americans are beloved. It's true. But Normandy is one of those. And it's a wonderful thing, and this was an experience that brought it home to me in a very, very big way. Yes, ma'am. There was a beautiful poem. I'm trying to repeat this for the folks.
Beautiful poem.
Yeah.
Somebody had written on a plaque. About soldiers, very poignant. I have no idea who wrote it. That really touched me. And then as we left, I turned around, and across the street from the cemetery, we were building a golf course.
There was a golf course across the
Just building
cemetery.
it, and I had such a funny feeling about it.
Yeah, it's almost a blasphemy. It was
Matter of fact,
65
it's now
years
an
ago.
area that's famous for a film festival.
Yeah.
Normandy is very famous for a film festival.
Right.
So it's become a resort.
Film festival there in Normandy?
Yes, it's become a resort area.
Right, it has become something there. Yeah. Yes.
I was in Normandy in 1950.
You were in Normandy. I'm merely repeating it for them.
There were no museums, simply crosses.
Just crosses, no museums in 1950?
49.
Yeah. Of course, that was just, 5 years after the war ended. They were probably putting things back together. But there are a lot of museums there now. And I remember one museum had a complete glider assembled, rather enormous. And I was amazed to see the glider was made out of canvas and wood. They would use plywood and canvas on those gliders. They carried jeeps in there and ammunition and everything else. You had your hand. Yes.
when we were there, we went to one of the stanchions that was telling about that, and there was an elderly couple, a young couple there.
Yes.
And the gentleman, the elderly gentleman was there. He landed at Normandy.
He had landed at
And
Normandy.
he had his child with him. And she said it was the first time that he has talked about it.
That's right. I have found, quite frankly, maybe many of you have too, that veterans of the Second World War don't talk about it much. You really have to drag it out of them at all. My uncle never did. That's very common, and that's why a lot of this great heroism is forever lost. How many of you have relatives that are still alive that served in the Second World War? Any of you? Have you recorded them? You have.
He did, the second lieutenant, my uncle,
You've recorded them.
his family,
Yeah.
wrote a small book of all his experiences.
Good, because it's critically important since they're dying by the thousands. You were in the Second World War, Howie? On a transport. Have you recorded your experience? Do it. You should take.
I may have recorded some letters to my mother.
Well, you should. You should write it out if you have to, and if not, do it. Were you in the Second World War?
Yeah.
You were.
Most of us prefer forgetting about it.
I know most of you would prefer forgetting about it. That's a very common, very interesting comment. It's the case with most. The problem is that I think it's critically important that there be a record, and a record for your kids and your grandchildren and so forth as to what did happen there and what took place. Otherwise, it'll be lost forever. It was a tremendous heroism. I'm sure you underwent a lot of horror. Yes?
I done the major universities the following year. I was the Rutgers University, the oral history of World War II UEIs and Rutgers graduates.
I'm going to repeat that for them. Gentlemen went to Rutgers, and there's an oral history project at Rutgers University for their undergraduates of people who lived through the Second World War.
It's on
That's
the,
right.
it's on the internet.
On the internet. That's very good. Terrific. Yes, sir.
There's a man around Pittsfield who is recording anybody who wants to be recorded. His name is Tyrone Bellinger.
Let me repeat this. Tyrone Bellinger, B-E-L-L-I-N-G-E-R.
B-E-L-A-N-G-E-R.
B-E-L-A-N-G-E-R in Pittsfield, who's recording people that served in the Second World War.
And he's, I think, recording me tomorrow.
Recording you tomorrow. Fantastic. Well, how opportune. That's fabulous. Great. You should make a
I
record
gotta
of
bring a
that.
picture, I gotta bring my pen, I gotta bring my...
What theater did you serve in?
Philippines.
In the Philippines. You were in the Pacific Theater. Right. Yes, back there.
Could you please spell the name of that city, that village?
Yeah, H-I-E-S-I-L-L-E. H-I-E-S-V-I-L-L-E. Yaville. Yes. It's a very tiny village. Yes, up there.
Yeah, I remember the hills there, and they were very steep, but when we got up to the top, they had these mortar things with the guns that were built
Right.
in cement that you don't know how they even broke through that, because they were just covering the whole.
It's remarkable. When you go to the beaches, as a number of you have, the gun emplacements of the Germans are still there. They were dug enormously deeply. Rommel was a very, very capable guy, and he knew what he was doing. And with all the shelling, and with all the bombardment opening up on those units, they were still there. And they're still there to this day, as a matter of fact, which attests to the guts that it took our troops to take those beaches. They're incredible. Any other thoughts on this?
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Was there any truth to the statement that many, if not most, of the generals that invaded Normandy had never seen combat before?
I think it's quite likely. I don't know the exact answer to that, but I think it's quite likely that many of them had not seen combat before. Yes.
That's why they were picked.
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. It's an interesting question. The question is, the GIs that invaded in the invasion had been picked because they had not had combat experience. Probably, it's an interesting comment. I can see why you would make that having lived through the Second World War. Yeah, yes.
In the New Orleans World War II Museum, there's on the first floor an actual model of the Higgins landing craft
Oh, yeah, the Higgins landing craft.
by Eisenhower. Eisenhower and Higgins, there's a big painting with Eisenhower's arm around Higgins,
Yeah.
who manufactured these landing craft. And it's a very interesting story of how he made them in New Orleans. He started out as a private manufacturer of small vessels, and his first prototype was unsatisfactory for the Navy because the troops had to jump over the sides, and of course, if they had done that, they would have been killed by the Nazis.
Yeah.
So he said, well, come back in 3 weeks and we'll re-engineer this and I'll make a prototype that you can use, which he did. The front part of it drops onto the beach and we rush onto the beach. And he
Right.
made them by the thousands.
Yes, the Higgins boats
landing
were
craft.
LSTs, basically. Yeah, and I think their original problems were that the drafts were too deep, so they had to get very shallow draft, things that could get in close to the shore before those fronts opened up. Yeah, but it was.
I'd like to say something.
It didn't take place.
Here's one from Great Barrington.
Pardon me? Oh, Great
Great
Barrington.
Barrington.
Well,
Barrington.
just your hand up, yes.
There are two things. First of all, the guys who were at D-Day basically had never seen combat before. We were hard pressed to maintain our position in Italy as well as North Africa and the Pacific, so that they could not transfer troops for D-Day. The other thing I would like to say is that a very dear friend of mine, a guy who just died this last year at the age of 99, spent 2 years as a combat surgeon in North Africa and Italy during World War II. His name was Dr. Harold Loughman. I had the privilege of knowing him. What he did as a combat surgeon, it was Army protocol. If people had lower leg injuries that were severe vascular injuries, they would amputate the legs because there was very little else that could be done. This Dr. Loughman managed to use bypass grafts, venous grafts, and salvage leg after leg after leg due to this procedure, and he could not report this because it was against Army protocol. He was a vascular surgeon, and eventually, years later, he did report what he had done and really laid some groundwork in terms of revascularization, reestablishing blood supply to limbs that were injured in such a way.
What a fascinating story. Could you all hear that? Yeah, great story. Thank you. Is there more to it? Please, I didn't mean to cut you off. That's a great story. Is there more to it?
Yes. He recently wrote, or at least 5 years ago, wrote his life as a surgeon, really a remarkable man who, in the last years of his life, developed macular degeneration and could no longer operate. He was a professor of experimental surgery at Albert Einstein College of Medicine, and our careers had crossed, so I became very interested in him. He had written a book about the first 95 years of his life. He was perfectly lucid, and it was one of the most extraordinary readings that I have ever encountered. He was going to write what his life was like from 95 to 100. However, he died in his 99th year, and we were at his, just an amazing guy.
God bless him, what a marvelous story.
What is the name of that book?
That's just a great story. What's the name of his book, you remember?
His book is called, what was it, Lou?
I'm not sure.
I think it was the first 95 years of my life. 95 years.
What was his last name again?
95 alive.
What was the last name of his last name?
His name was Harold Loughman.
Loughman?
Loughman. L-A-U-F-M-A-N. He also...
Loughman, L-A-U-F-M-A-N. Sounds like a remarkable guy. I'm sure there are...
I'm not finished. He was an artist, a writer, a great musician, in addition to the fact that at the age of 85, he started an engineering company which designed operating rooms, and no ORs have been built since 1900 without his, 1995 without his designs.
If you tell me that he parachuted from a plane at age 95, this guy's extraordinary. I'm sure there are many, many extraordinary stories of World War II veterans. That's one of the best I've heard in a long time. That's very good. Any other thoughts here? Yes?
David, the bombing of the chateau, was that described a friendly fire? Because I don't think there were many German planes in the air.
No, that was a German plane.
It was?
Yeah, it was a German plane that bombed them out. Yes?
Well, the movie and the program MASH, even though it was in Korea and not in France, showed you the trials and tribulations and a lot of jokes, of course, of the Army surgeons.
Yeah. Yes, Sue?
Can I tell a story about a Dutch man that I met?
Sure.
All right, this Dutchman had been head of the Indonesian school system at the beginning of the Second World War. And I met him on a trip that I took in 1956, which was now 11 years after the war. He had been imprisoned by the Japanese. He was in a Japanese prison camp. They were portly Dutch people. And his wife said to me one day that at the end of the war, he weighed 86 pounds, she weighed 66 pounds. And he never said anything. But one day, he held out his thumbs to me and he said, I have this, so I'll never forget. And his fingernails had just been pulled out of his thumbs.
Oh, my God, yeah.
Subsequent to that, I met Howard. I married him. We were in Europe on a honeymoon, and I took him to and they were living
Great.
in Hague. So,
Terrific, great story. Okay, now next week we're going to finish up. It's a 6th session. It's I call it Einstein, the letter and the bomb. We're going to deal with the happenstance that resulted in our getting the atomic bomb and not the Germans. It's a rather fascinating tale. In any event, it's been great being here with you. We'll see you next week.